Wrestling was a rite of passage for a lot of young men growing up. You'd wake up early in the morning on Saturday, you'd watch your cartoons, and then you'd get the latest updates in wrestling from, let's say, WWF Superstars. F, not E. That's how old we are. But they put their lives and their health on the line to give us a lot of entertaining matches which we try to emulate in our backyards, in our schoolyards, in our bedrooms, and we got really hurt. And people don't like kids getting hurt. And that's why we invented video games.
Wrestling games have come a long way from the current days of titles like WWE 2K16. But back in the day, whatever games they made were the games you got. They didn't need to be a technical masterpiece, they just had to be playable, and they had to be fun. And today, we're going to count down 10 of the most notable games from the 16-bit era. I'm Tim.
And this is Kevin.
And these are Haruokay's top 10 16-bit wrestling games. Number 10.
WCW Super Wrestling.
This game is making the list because it's the only WCW wrestling game to come out around this time. The game has a few modes to choose from, but when you get to that character select screen, everything goes to hell. I mean, look at this thing. There's not a single name under any one of these character portraits, and unless you're a hardcore wrestling fan, you are not going to know who these fucking people are. If there's one thing I can hope for you when you're playing this game, it's that you didn't take any hallucinogenic drugs beforehand. Now the reason I mention this is because within a few seconds of the character select screen, the character portraits will actually start to jump at you like they're coming through the screen like the girl from the fucking Ring. Now, with all of that being said, it was kind of cool that when you did select a character, you would get a full page introduction of them, including their name, a short write-up of their background, and their specialty move. Now, the game's animations can make everything feel a little bit stiff, but control-wise, it was still serviceable. And it is kind of a novelty to see characters like Dustin Rhodes, Ric Flair, and the Steiner Brothers, and Sting all in one game together. If you have a Super Nintendo and you own this game, and it's the only wrestling game you can get your hands on, then it's definitely worth a quick playthrough. Otherwise.
Number 9. Wrestle War. Wrestle War is a bit of an interesting game. Originally started as an arcade title made by Sega in Japan and ported over to home consoles only in Japan and Europe, so it's technically only a Mega Drive game. The game, however, is extremely beautiful to look at. In terms of the sprite size, the actual area you get to fight in, the game is very visually pleasing. However, the game does this very weird 3D camera effect, so when you move to the center of the ring, it switches sides. In fact, if the sides were not marked with red and blue, you'd never know what would happen, and it's very disorienting, especially if you're trying to set up a really good move or pin your opponent. Again though, it's really cool for what it did at the time. You beat your first wrestler, and then you get to choose from all of these wonderful cities in America, all 5 of them. But it's a nice little footnote in the wrestling genre. However, on this list, it only gets to number 9.
1, 2, 3.
Number 8.
King of the Monsters. Now, at first glance, King of the Monsters may seem like a very confusing title for this list, but the beauty of King of the Monsters is that it's actually a wrestling game disguised as a kaiju fighting game. The game was a very fun experience on both the Super Nintendo and the Genesis, although if you came from playing the Neo Geo version, which had 12 stages instead of 8 and 6 characters instead of 4, yeah, you might be a little pissed off about that. But there's enough fun and creativity in King of the Monsters for a brief but enjoyable experience. You'll wrestle against another monster in different parts of the city while military forces are constantly firing upon you. And, like every kaiju movie ever made, military weaponry really doesn't do shit. This game gives you a sense of scale that no other wrestling game at the time could provide. Every step and action you take would destroy a different section of the ring. The game even had electrified walls that would act as wrestling ropes and would shock the living shit out of you every time you stepped into them. In terms of content, the game definitely isn't the most robust on this list, but it's definitely worth at least a good 10 minutes of playthrough before you switch over to a Godzilla movie or an episode of Kaiju Big Battle.
Number 7. Natsume Championship Wrestling. Natsume Championship Wrestling is a really interesting game. For the remainder of this, I'm just going to call it NCW as it likes to be called. When you get to the menu, it kind of looks very bare bones and basic. Everything just kind of gets zoomed in and highlighted, but it has a lot of modes that you see in the standard 16-bit wrestling games. But here's where it's a little bit different. Has a lot of pre-made wrestlers, nobody well known, this is all just made up by Natsume. But the game itself is kind of interesting. The sprites are not too detailed, it's kind of cartoony in a way, even though the actual pictures of the wrestlers look really real. So these could be they could be real guys, they could be guys that work at Natsume, they could be homeless men they saw as they walked across the street. Unlike the previous games on this list so far, it's not very stiff. In fact, the controls are fairly fluid, as basic as they are, but you can even do something as simple as a reversal, which you expect to have in a wrestling game. Either way, it's a fun title, it's pretty bare bones, but it's really exciting to play. And honestly, if you want to emulate the feel of working at the Spanish announce table, Natsume Championship Wrestling is the game for you.
Number 6. WWF Super WrestleMania. The first WWF title on this list, and most definitely not the last, Super WrestleMania was the first of a trilogy of wrestling games to come out from the WWF on the 16-bit consoles. There were a few different features depending on whether you picked up the Sega or the Nintendo version. The Super Nintendo version had a bigger roster with 10 as opposed to Sega's 8, but it didn't have any of the wrestlers' specialty moves. The Sega Genesis version, on the other hand, only gave you 8 wrestlers to choose from, but everybody had their own specialty move kept intact. Compared to earlier WWF video games, Super WrestleMania was a massive step up in quality. In addition, it also set the formula for later WWF games to come out on both consoles. And if we're going to be honest, those other 2 games are probably a lot more interesting, so... Next! Number 5.
Fire Pro Wrestling! Even the name sounds exciting. Fire Pro Wrestling is an amazing series. Only in Japan. We did get a couple of titles, but honestly, this is probably one of the premier wrestling titles you're going to find on any 16-bit console. Holy shit. Let me talk to you about Fire Pro Wrestling. First of all, the actual controls in this game are very fluid, very easy to master, and the grapple system is probably the most technical system you're going to find in a wrestling game on a 16-bit console. Not to mention you have a huge roster of characters, plus room to create your own characters with different knickknacks, different stages, different things that go in the ring, your skin color, your wrestling type. You get a fair amount of customization for a very early on game. If you're looking to play Fire Pro Wrestling, you don't have a lot of options when it comes to the 16-bit titles here in North America. You can download a lot of the ROM translations, and some of them are really cool because it takes a lot of the wrestlers that are based off real wrestlers and actually puts their original names on there. With the roster of characters you get in Fire Pro Wrestling, there is an amazing amount of replay value, especially for an early 16-bit game franchise. This is probably, again, a premier fighting franchise. I am so disappointed we never got it outside of the 2 Game Boy titles and a PlayStation 2 title. In fact, I would give the Intercontinental Championship to Fire Pro Wrestling. I love saying the name. Fire Pro Wrestling! Number 4. WWF Royal Rumble. WWF Royal Rumble is the second title in LJN's WWF game series. This one has some improvements over the previous title. Obviously, you still have the grappling system, which is kind of a tug-of-war style, except now you have a visual representation, so you can actually see who has the advantage in battle or who is actually going to perform one of their specialty moves. Has the same type of look and feel as the previous games, although I find that the control style is a little bit tighter on this model, even though it is using the same game engine. Similar to Super WrestleMania, both titles have some differences in their roster. They share 7 wrestlers: Bret Hart, The Undertaker, Shawn Michaels, Razor Ramon, Randy Savage, Crush, and of course the narcissist Lex Luger. The remaining wrestlers are going to be fleshed out based on if you have the Super Nintendo version, which gives you Ric Flair, Mr. Perfect, Ted DiBiase, Yokozuna, and Tatanka! The Genesis version replaces those wrestlers with Hulk Hogan, IRS, Jim Duggan, The Model, and Papa Shango. WWF Royal Rumble was probably one of the genesis most loved games. It's actually pretty high in a lot of top 10 lists for some people. WWF Royal Rumble. If you haven't had a chance to play it, I highly recommend it. It's a really good 16-bit experience when it comes to a WWF game, and in a way it kind of paved the way for many other titles to come.
Number 3. WWF Raw. Okay, be honest, are you getting tired of us talking about these games yet? Don't worry, this is the last one of the 3. And fortunately, it's also the best. WWF Raw took everything that was great about the first 2 games, Royal Rumble and Super WrestleMania, and gave us a more condensed and refined version, which is easily the best of the series. WWF Raw improved upon everything. It had better graphics, it had more wrestlers, it had a better presentation, it had more moves, and it had more modes. It was easily the most complete WWF wrestling experience on the Super Nintendo and Genesis. The Super Nintendo and Genesis versions gave you the exact same roster this time around. You got wrestlers such as Bret the Hitman Hart, The Undertaker, Shawn Michaels, Bam Bam Bigelow, Yokozuna, Doink the Clown, and a pre-X-Pac 1-2-3 Kid. It even gave you Luna Vachon, which was probably the only female wrestler to ever make it into this series. All 3 of the WWF LJN games were fun, but if you were put into a room, shown 3 games, and had a gun put to your family's head in order to choose, you'd have to pick Raw. Because if you didn't pick Raw, well, you'd be an orphan. No, we can't do that.
Yes, we can.
I kinda want to.
Number 2. WWF WrestleMania, the arcade game. WWF WrestleMania, the arcade game, which is a mouthful to say, was a very interesting game. So it was developed by Midway, brought home by Acclaim, and it had various console ports. So you had it even on the PC and Sega Saturn. The game played similar to Mortal Kombat, so it was kind of over-the-top ridiculous. Like The Undertaker would shoot ghosts from his hands, or some moves would create, like for Bam Bam Bigelow, he'd create actual fire, and so on. The game was designed to be a very quick and fun game to play with a very arcade game style, which in the 90s, if you've known this, arcade games were a big thing. Take a look at NFL Blitz, for example. You want to take something very complex and make it very simple for someone to understand, but at the same time, you want to make it more fun. So, whereas WWF Raw is all about feel of the game, WWF WrestleMania, the arcade game, really emphasized the fun factor, because all in all, this game was super fun. Seeing your character run into the side of the ring, similar to watching your little character portrait crawl up on Mortal Kombat, to the actual presentation, everything just seems really fun. On the Super Nintendo, it looks very vivid. On the Sega Genesis, there is a bit of muting in some of the colors and music, but you know, Sega Genesis, it's what it does. But all in all, it was a fun game, and it had a lot of marketing. You couldn't open up a gaming magazine without seeing those ads in there. It was very well advertised. Now obviously, if you're gonna go for realism or you want a real wrestling experience, obviously you're gonna go for one of the LJN WWF games. However, if you want something that's fun, easy to play, easy to pick up, and looks really good for the time, WWF WrestleMania the arcade game is really the one you want to go for. God, that is a mouthful. And it's not fun to say. Nothing like Fire Pro!
Number 1. Saturday Night Slam Masters. Oh, hey Kevin, look, it's a Capcom game at the top of one of our top 10 lists.
It's like they never stopped making really good games in the 90s. The fuck, Capcom?
Now, Saturday Night Slam Masters takes all of the joy of Street Fighter and puts it into a wrestling game. And if you played any Street Fighter back in the day and had a love of wrestling, this was like a dream match for you.
You had a fantastic rosters of characters, you had vivid, beautiful colors. Everything was just very animated. It was really fun to play if you played it in the arcade or if you played it at home. And it really captured that over-the-top ridiculousness that you get with wrestling. If you're looking for something that's fun, over-the-top, pretty much everything that wrestling really was back in the 90s, Saturday Night Slam Masters is like a love letter to all of that.
That's right, back then, you didn't want a realistic simulation. You wanted to perform moves on your opponent that would kill a normal man. And that's exactly what Saturday Night Slam Masters gave you. On top of that, this was one of the few Capcom party games where you could actually get a multi-tap for the Super Nintendo and play the game with 4 players. The game had a diverse lineup of wrestlers to choose from, none of which you really ever saw in a Capcom game after that, with the exception, of course, of Mayor Mike Hagar.
In fact, a lot of the moves that Mike Hagar uses, some of them are actually copied by one other famous wrestler, and that is the Geef, Zangief.
The Red Cyclone!
But really, Saturday Night Slam Masters makes perfect sense as a number 1 for our top 10 wrestling list. The controls were tight and responsive, the graphics were great, the replayability was definitely there. Combine all of those things together and you've got one fun-ass game, and the finest wrestling game you'll find on the 16-bit. It's a fun wrestling game, it scratches that final fight itch, it's infinitely replayable, and it definitely deserves to be our number 1 16-bit wrestling game.
Hey guys, I'm back. It's been a long time. Tim's been doing really good with Haruokay, and I've come back to continue on what we've started, and it's been a really fun time. And I want you guys to like, comment, and subscribe to the video because it's been super fun. Take a look at some links in the description if you want to check out some of our older stuff, or check out Cartridge Club. It's a really cool community of like-minded individuals. They also have a Patreon. I highly recommend supporting them because they're doing a lot of great work. And we'll see you next time, so stay tuned.